Loop Azure meetup. We are 100% remote this meeting, but we normally do meet in our downtown Chicago office in the Civic Opera House. And we're just going to go ahead and have them remote for as long as necessary. But I'm really happy that all of you can join. And a special welcome to members of a meetup that I'm a part of, Chicago Women Developers. We've extended this invite to them as well. So thank you for joining. If you're not familiar with Chicago Women Developers, they are on the meetup site as well. They meet up every Thursday, I believe, and I believe they're having remote meetings as well. So if you know any women who might be interested, who work in technology, definitely check them out. Tonight, we are going to talk about Azure ARM Template Foundations. As Allison said, my name is Jennifer Hajduk. I'm a senior Azure engineer at 10th Magnitude. I've been with 10th Magnitude for about 4 years now. So I've been working with ARM templates for, I want to say 5 or 6 years. So I've been working with them quite a bit in various capacities. And I'm hoping that by the end of this meeting, you will, number one, perhaps if you're already familiar with ARM templates, maybe you learned a little something new about the foundational aspects of them. And number two, give you the tools you need to start deploying them yourself. Hopefully right after this meeting, you're going to get super excited about ARM templates. And I'm going to give you the tools that you need to get started with them tonight. So with that, I just, and as slide, my credentials, I have a list of certifications, MCSA, MCSE. As many of you know, Microsoft decided to start retiring those as well as the MCSD. So I'm really looking forward to having to take 2 more on top of the 5 certifications I've already taken to get this far. I am a incoming master's student at U of I, UC in computer science. And all of this just to say, I love learning about Azure and learning how to work with it. My career has mostly been focused around infrastructure and deploying cloud infrastructure using mainly ARM templates for the most part. I've been working with them, like I said, for about 5 or 6 years now. So a question, we're going to take it back a little bit and think about why would we use ARM templates? Well, when we get clients who are maybe new to Azure here at 10th Magnitude, they have a lot to think about already as far as mobilizing their business units to get ready for the cloud. And ARM templates are an easy on-ramp for them. It's native automation. So there are other tools. For example, we sometimes work with a tool called Terraform. Some of you may have heard of that. And I have nothing against it. I prefer ARM templates just because they are native and features, as soon as Azure comes out with another resource or another feature, it's almost, automatically available for use in an ARM template. And so having that quick on-ramp for clients is pretty valuable. Other tools out there, third-party tools, again, are great. However, you may have to wait for a member of that community to write a provider for a certain resource or to write some code for that certain resource. And so we kind of eliminate that waiting period for the most part with ARM templates because they are native to Azure. Multi-service, declarative, and idempotent. The great thing about ARM templates is you can deploy your entire application, your entire service with one ARM template. So you can have multiple different types of services in your ARM template, VMs, virtual networks, apps, app service environments, things like that. Whatever you need to do to deploy, you can have it in that one ARM template. and not have to think about going in manually and enabling each of those services. You deploy obviously exactly what you want by being declarative, and then the repeatability and the idempotency of ARM templates is appealing to clients as well. Most people think that when they think ARM templates, they think resources, and they don't necessarily think about governance or other types of services. So if you're familiar with Azure policies, things like that, RBAC roles, all of those services can be deployed via ARM. And ARM templates really allow us to be able to keep a repository of our infrastructure as code, keeping it that way. And I'm going to give you some tools today to get started and getting your own repository set up so that you can work with them. And that's really the idea behind infrastructure as code, is keeping those services as code in your ARM templates and having them in a repository so that you can version them and things like that. So again, starting with the basics here, we're going to start with some of the basics of JSON or JSON. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I'm not an expert in JSON, but it's important to know about it and how it works a little bit in order to kind of understand the format of ARM templates. So it's just JavaScript object notation. That's what it stands for. The quote unquote easy to read is depending on how you ask. Whether it be clients or developers, it can be easy to read depending on how often you use them and how familiar you are with them. But essentially, it's used as a format for structuring data for sending across a network. So if you worked a little bit in web development, you may have worked with JSON before. And so that's typically what it's used for, that server to client communication. It's some of the special features about JSON are attribute or name value pairs separated by a colon. And we're going to look at examples of ARM templates for each of these features. Use of curly braces and use of commas between objects. So if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you have your objects that are essentially listed out in the ARM template, and they're defined by attributes and as well as properties. So just a little bit about JSON, so we know exactly where we're coming from. So a little bit about template deployment basics. What's required is your deployment JSON file. And that file contains all of the resources that you want to deploy. And that is really the only required file that you need. Optionally, you can include a parameters file. And I struggled with this quite a bit in the beginning when I was learning about Azure ARM templates is, if I can deploy my JSON file with just the deployment file, why do I need a parameters file? Well, unless you are an organization who deploys everything straight to production, you probably have lower environments. You have dev, QA, UAT, things like that, or UAT, things like that. And what's helpful is you can have different parameter files for different values so that you can supply those values depending on your environment to your deployment files. So you may have 3 different parameter JSON files, dev, QA, prod, but you're all going to, depending on which environment you're deploying, you're going to send them to that one JSON file. So they are optional, but they can help reduce fat fingering environments and help really reduce human error when deploying to different environments. Modular deployments, again, you can deploy, each environment as you need to. Keep all of your resources associated with an environment in one ARM template, or two if you choose a parameter file, and kind of really think about logically containing them that way on a per environment basis or whatever your business dictates. Another important thing to understand is that deployments go into Azure resource groups. So any resource you deploy into Azure is going to go into a resource group. And a resource group is just a logical collection of resources. If you view them in the portal, that's where you're just going to be able to view all the resources you deployed. Resources can reach across resource groups. So if you deploy a VNet in one resource group and a VM in another resource group, you can have the NIC deployed to that virtual network. It's not a hard physical separation. It's just a logical separation of resources. Another thing is that we need to understand is ARM template limits. So you have 256 parameters and variables, 800 resources, including copy count, which is important to note. Within an ARM template, you can have a resource that you iterate multiple times, but you have to understand that that iteration counts towards your ARM template limit. 64 output values, and that's going to make a little bit more sense in the next slide once we look at the schema. About 24,000 characters and 4 megabytes in size. I personally have never seen an ARM template this large. I never want to see an ARM template this large. Seems really, really excessive. If you find yourself approaching these limits, and you probably won't, but if you do find yourself approaching these limits, that's sort of a conversation about taking a step back and looking at what exactly we're deploying. Most of the clients we work with don't have to deploy their VNet with their VM with other resources that may need to access that VNet. Maybe you take the VNet in this example, maybe you take that out of the template and deploy that once, and then you have that ARM template, and then other resources are kept in other ARM templates. So it's just kind of a logical separation or segmentation of that we have to think about. Again, I've never seen an ARM template even come close to approaching these limits, but they're there just so we know about them. So this is something that I come back to every now and then, and it shows me something new every time. So this is a bare bones structure of an ARM template with no resources, no parameters, and nothing. This is what it would look like. So just to go over the pieces a little bit, the schema at the top, essentially what that does is it pulls the file and basically compares your ARM template against an ARM template schema. And so basically this is a validation step to make sure that you're sending in, properly constructed JSON, and it makes sense based on what Azure will accept as far as their resource providers and as far as ARM templates. Most of the time, we're not building ARM templates from scratch, thankfully. But it's important to know that this date in the ARM template, 2019-0401, that's called an API version. That's what we refer to it as when we're talking about resources. And that number, that value can change depending on how you are deploying your ARM template. So if you're using VS Code with an ARM extensions tool, which we're actually going to look at a little bit later, that may be correct. If you're using another editor for your ARM templates, you may have to change that schema. It just depends on really it just depends on how you're deploying your template. essentially. But honestly, it doesn't change often. And most templates that you're going to pull from different sources will have the proper schema version. So it's not something that we change really. Content version, I've always referred to this as poor man's source control. Essentially, it allows you to update the version of your template as you make changes. This isn't used very often because we have repositories and we have editors that we use to push and pull to those repositories. So it's not something that we use very often. Generally, when you pull an ARM template, if you get an example ARM template, it's going to be set to 1.0 or something like that. It's not something we really need to worry about for deployment purposes. So you can generally leave the default or set it to 1.0. API profile is one that I became aware of more recently. And what that does is when we get down to the resources part of our schema, you have to define an API version for that resource. And so what the API profile piece allows us to do is to define API versions for each type of resource in our template. So you can actually define your virtual machine API that you want to use up front. You can define your web app API version that you want to use up front. You can do that in the front of the template without actually having to define it on the resource, which is a pretty cool feature. It's not something that I've seen used a lot. I don't think many people are aware of it, but it's something that you can look at into using. And I'm going to actually grab a link for you guys so that you can take a look at this. Just give me 1 second. Template structure and syntax. Navigating in and out of teams is always fun. There. And so this is basically going over what I'm going over now. So if you want, you can follow along. We have our parameters and variables section next. Parameters are provided. The difference between parameters and variables is that parameters are provided at runtime. So you define those when you deploy your template. And variables are generally, variables are not provided at runtime, and they can be hard set values. They can be comprised of functions. They can really get complicated, or they can be really simple. It just really depends on what you're deploying. But this is generally where we may see functions like resource ID or concatenate or things like that, where we're forming more complex properties for a resource. And again, we'll take a look at all of this. Functions are different. So this function section is different from the functions you might be used to in ARM templates. Really, we have two types of functions in ARM templates. We have user-defined functions and template-defined functions. And so I'll put another link in here for us. User-defined functions essentially allow us to output a certain value. You feed it maybe parameters or something that's already existing inside your template, and it will output a value. The example that's given in the link is storage account name. So if you input the parameters that it expects, it will output a unique storage account name. And so that's a little bit different. Again, I don't see this used as often either. What I see used more often are the template provided functions, such as resource ID, concat, things like that. Resources, pretty straightforward. That's where you would define what resources that you want to deploy. And output values are values you may want to capture after the deployment is complete. Maybe you want to put out the name of your VM. Maybe you want to put out an IP address that you of a resource you've deployed. And so outputs allows us to do that. And so I think it's going to make a little bit more sense if we can see it. So basically, that whole schema we looked at, all that's really required is the resources section. You can deploy resources that have no parameters and no variables. You can hard code it, or maybe that resource just doesn't require any, that's fine. But generally, we have our parameters, our variables, and our resources. So we're just going to talk about those three really quickly. So our parameter section, the required attributes are the parameter name as well as the type of parameter. And that's really all that's required. You can add additional steps. We can see here we have the metadata for each parameter in this example. And the metadata is just a description for documentation purposes. If you expect other people are going to use this template, maybe you might want to consider providing a description of what that parameter is for. Some other functions for parameters are we can allow minimum or maximum values. We can have a section for values that are allowed, so you can define, okay, a certain parameter may be called environment only accepts dev, QA, prod. So you can specify your allowed values or use template functions such as concat, things like that. We can see in this example, we have resource group.location as the location. So wherever this template is getting deployed, wherever the resource group is, that's what's going to be outputted. That's what's going to be input into this location parameter. Variables can be simple, like I said, or they can get fairly complex. So a variable can be as simple as just a string, a hard-coded string, and that's fine. Here we see an example of it getting a little bit more complex. And this variable section was pulled from a Linux VM. And so we see we can use our template-defined functions, which are different from the user-defined functions in the documentation. And essentially, we can use the resource ID given the proper function parameters. We can concatenate different parts of a name, for example, or a reference to a resource. What concat does essentially is it joins parts of a name together. And we can see that we have a variable, a hard-coded piece, as well as a parameter. So concat is just going to grab these parameters and variables, join it together with this, and it's going to be the resource ID of a subnet in this case. Resource ID is a little bit different, and it's going to essentially have the resource ID of the resource that we're looking for. It's going to automatically populate that resource ID with the subscription ID and the resource group. This is a Linux configuration. As you can see, it's collapsed here, but I expanded it to show you that variables can contain also more complex objects. So essentially, the template resource that's calling this variable is going to get this entire object passed to it. And so you can do a lot with variables in ARM templates. It just depends on what is needed for that particular resource. So an example of a resource is what I have here is a storage account. So what's required for the resources section is the type, the API version, and the name. The other parts of the resource are can be optional. It just depends on the actual resource schema. and I will pull that for you. Whether you use, as we saw before, we can use concat, resource ID, things like that. All of that is defined by the resource schema. So in addition to the schema for the ARM template, we have a schema for the templates as well. Let's see. This in the chat. So this is a great page if you're just getting started with a resource and you want to see all of the available properties for that resource. You can go to that page essentially and in the Microsoft documentation and look and see what's available to you. Some of these properties are optional, metadata tags, and then some may be required, such as the kind property, for deploying a storage account in particular. Some of the properties may be able to use concat, some may be able to use resource ID. It just actually depends on the schema and what it expects. So that's a good resource if you're just getting started with a new type of resource and you want to know what's allowed. Some common ARM template functions. I've talked a lot about concat and resource ID, but they really are some of the most used functions that you use in ARM templates. And I think I have a question. So which section would you use to pull a key from the key vault to connection to a storage account? So that would be a resource level type of thing. It would depend on if the resource can pull that key from the key vault. There's no particular parts. For example, at the resource level, an example of that is the storage account I just showed in the last slide. If you're able to do that from that particular resource, then that should actually be defined in the resource schema that I've linked right above you. But it's not something that is defined by itself in the template. It's on a resource level. Another common function is function is the if statement. Prior to having the if statement, sometimes we would have to have two different copies of an ARM template for deploying it to a particular environment, because one template might have might deploy certain resources, whereas a different version of that environment may not deploy certain resources. And so what the if statement allowed us to do is just essentially to have all of that logic inside the ARM templates. And just an example of how to read this, if parameters, we're taking a parameter, we can use our parameters and variables here. The first part, if this parameter is equal to none. So if we set this to none, we use this property. We use this value for the property public IP. If not, we don't use anything. And I'm going to pull up another link for you. Essentially, some of these functions that are available are a little bit obtuse. However, they are extremely useful when deploying certain resources and incorporating certain logic. And I'm actually going to pull this up if I can. So when we're talking about ARM template functions, we looked at concat, we look at resource ID, which is further down. There are a lot of functions available to you, some which are a little bit more obvious: min, max, minimum and maximum values. When we talk about our comparison functions, we use these mainly in our if statements, is where I've seen them used the most. Date time functions, if we need to convert or get the date time of deployment, or have that in UTC time. There are a lot of functions that are available for us to use. It's just some are used more than often, and you may have to come in here every now and then to find the function that's right for your template. So I will put this in the chat as well. And so these are just the more common. There, as you can see, there's so many functions available for you to use. Definitely take a look at them. There are some that that have been added since I've looked at it, and some that I wasn't familiar with. So take a look at that. So one thing that I link are the resource schemas already. As we talked about before, what you are able to do with a certain resource is available to you to look at in the resource schema. So the templates have their own schema, and then the resources have their own schema. And I like this page because it explains exactly what's expected in each property of the resource. So maybe VM templates, for example, that you've seen have a lot more properties than what you knew were available. So definitely take a look at the resource schemas. If there's some property that you want to add to a resource, you can see if it's available there. So these are some of the more popular deployment methods, and we're going to take a look at the PowerShell deployment method a little bit later. But also be aware that the Azure CLI is available to you. It's available to you as a download, as well as in the Azure portal itself. So take a look at that. It allows you to get up and running pretty quickly, and it's a fairly easy language to understand, especially if you're available, or especially if you're familiar with some of the PowerShell commands as far as deploying templates. The Azure CLI, PowerShell, as well as portal deployment. Template deployment in the portal is pretty cool. What that allows you to do is just copy paste a template and deploy it. So if you're not into using PowerShell or the Azure CLI, then definitely take a look at template deployment. But today we're going to stick with PowerShell. That is what I use to deploy templates most often. And quickly, I want to go over deployment modes. Deployment modes can be complete or incremental, and you really have to be careful of this. This really depends on the resource or the API version of the resource you're deploying. In complete mode, again, we said resource deployments go into a resource group. When you deploy a template in complete mode, you can delete resources that are not specified in that template. And mainly root level resources. And when they say root level, they really mean parent resources. So for an example, a virtual network would be a parent resource and a subnet would be a child resource. So this affects mainly root level or parent level resources. And complete mode is not supported by portal deployments. So a slide back, we saw a couple of different methods to deploy ARM templates. If you're doing the portal deployment, that's not supported in complete mode with ARM templates. Incremental may or may not leave resources unaffected. You may have resources that get reset to their default values. So you have to be careful of that, and you really have to research what you're deploying and how it can be affected. Template represents the final state of your resources. So any resources outside of your ARM template may or may not be affected. And this can get confusing. However, generally, if you're doing a clean deployment, you're going to deploy exactly what's in your ARM template. This is really comes into question when you're deploying, when you're redeploying your template with new properties. So definitely experiment and work with that a little bit before you just go ahead and deploy, because you may end up deleting some resources, and you may end up affecting some properties of resources or setting them back to their default values. Let's see. And this is just an example of complete and incremental mode. So we can see resource group contains ABC, and our template contains ABD, and what happens in each mode. Incremental usually just adds a resource, but some of these, depending on if it's in your template, some resources may be reset to default values. You have to be careful. And then when in complete mode, we can see resource C is completely gone and it's just deployed A, B, and D. So that's, I mean, I could go on about ARM template basics. There's a lot to it, but I know you guys just want to get started in deploying them. So what we have is, so just to get over some of the excuses that we have, I don't have an Azure subscription. Well, you can get one, and you have 12 months free plus $200 credit for 30 days, and always free ARM templates. I'm going to go ahead and copy that link. I'll get that link out to you in just a moment. I'll copy that and get all the next couple of links out to you guys. Let's see. Sorry about that. My copy isn't working as I thought it would. I will just put it in here. So that's the link you want to go to your Azure subscription. It will take. Yes, certain things are not available. There are definitely limits to what you're able to deploy. And those limits are based on sometimes the size of your deployments, sometimes how many hours your deployments are running, and sometimes different versions of a resource you're deploying. This is just a good way to kind of get started if you want to try it out, maybe deploy some things in ARM templates. But there are definitely restrictions, and they are listed out. As far as I know, they're listed out on the link in the chat. But if not, just know it's free, so you're not going to get, everything. Special restrictions around COVID. That's definitely understandable as far as regions and where you're able to deploy. Certain regions may be unavailable to you, and that's something that you have to look out for. But some of the best way to understand that or figure out which ones are unavailable is to get in there and experiment. But of course, with COVID, that's bringing some regions to a halt. I don't have any ARM template examples. You may say, okay, Jennifer, I'm not going to do an ARM template from scratch. And I'm not going to, take a schema and then fill it up with everything. And that is okay, because we have a plethora of examples. There are hundreds of templates that Microsoft has on their GitHub repository. And all those are available for you to grab. I actually clone them to my machine, or clone some of them to my machine. You can take them from the repository or fork them if you have a GitHub repository. You can fork them and so you have them on your own, make edits as you please. But these templates are readily available for you to start getting started with ARM templates and taking a look at them. Sometimes the best way to learn something is just by seeing a lot of examples. So definitely check that out. And for some reason, I'm going to, my copy isn't working very well. Luckily. There we go. So that's the link you can use to get started with that. So you have a subscription, albeit some restrictions. You have some ARM templates. The next thing you need would be an editor. So if you don't have an editor for ARM templates, something that I'm using very regularly is VS Code. if your company allows you to have copies of full-blown Visual Studio, that's great, but it's expensive and not everyone can afford that. So VS Code is a free download, and it's a way to get, it's a free editor, not just for ARM templates. There are definitely other languages that you can use within VS Code. I find it to be a fairly easy way to get started with ARM templates, but you can also do JavaScript, Python, PHP, as well as other technologies you can use with VS Code. So it's a really, really great tool for getting started with ARM templates, and it's pretty much my regular editor. Code.visualstudio.com/download. And so that is the link for VS Code. So with these tools that we have, I'm going to put this on my screen here. So right now, I have Visual Studio Code open. Again, it's the editor I use for most of my daily tasks. And one thing to note is that you will need the Azure Resource Manager ARM template extension in order to work more easily with JSON templates. So go ahead and download that. It's free. And it's really, really helpful as far as viewing ARM templates because, like I said, some people find JSON easy to look at, and some people definitely do not. So take a look at the ARM Azure Resource Manager ARM Tools extension. That's a mouthful. I'm going to open my repository. I have a quick start templates right here. And so more important than what's being deployed, essentially what we're going to do is work with PowerShell to deploy this template. This is our parameters file. As you can see, the ARM template extension makes it easy to color code and collapse or expand different sections. And essentially just our parameters, what we're going to use to input into the Azure deploy file. Or sorry, that was the Azure deploy file. I have what made me think it was a parameters file was I have my resources minimized. Apologies for that. This is our Azure deploy file. And this is our parameters file. Again, not necessary to have it. We could easily just hard code the values in here for hosting plan name and website name. But just to give you an example of what that looks like with both files. So what we need to do first is we need to create a resource group. Like I said, ARM templates are deployed into resource groups in Azure. But in order to authenticate to our Azure account, we need to use a command to do that. A command I use in PowerShell is login AZ account. We use connect AZ account here. There are a couple of commands to do it, but this is the one that I use most often. And a pop-up, I'm not going to type in my credentials here, but a pop-up just popped up for me. So I'm going to enter my credentials. And after I authenticated in that window, we can see my account, my subscription pops up, tenant ID, everything looks correct. So great. Now, fair warning, the demo gods have not been great to me today as far as viewing the resources we're going to deploy in the Azure portal. And what we are going to deploy is a hosting plan as well as a web app. Pretty simple, fair enough. One thing we didn't cover in the slides, this is a pretty simple template to get this concept through, is depends on. This is how you create dependencies in your resources between each resource. It depends on which resource, what dependencies you're going to include in the template. A web app just happens to depend on a hosting plan being deployed first. And so we have that here. As you can see, we're using a function to do that, and inputting the correct values that concat function accepts. And so that's how we create dependencies if you need something, if one thing has to be deployed before another. Otherwise, if you don't have this depends on, the ARM service will try to deploy all of the resources at once. And obviously, that's going to have you get some errors if, for example, this hosting plan is not deployed before a web app. So that's something that's very important to understand is dependencies. But on with the demo. Oops, I gotta go ahead and close this presentation mode. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, and next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our resource group where the resources are going to be deployed. And as you can see, we need a location. So I think I'm going to do this in Central US, or yeah, I think so. Okay. So we can see we got the output from that resource group deployed, no errors. Good to know. And now that we have that deployed, I'm hoping that we don't have the errors I was experiencing in the portal previously, early today, which happens sometimes. And here's our resource group we just deployed. The name, right now it's empty. Now for the final piece. We're going to create a new deployment. We specify our resource group, our template file, and our template parameters file. If your template is, for example, on GitHub, you can specify a template URI if you want. But I have these locally, and I actually have to make sure that I'm in the correct directory. Yeah. 201. So now we're going to make sure, because I have to locally have to specify that, so it knows where to find the Azure deploy in the parameters file. This might take a moment, but essentially if we go back to the portal, we should have started deploying. As you can see, it's thinking about it. And we should see resources pop up here. So we don't necessarily have to wait for this deployment. It may take a few minutes, but I just wanted to give you guys the tools that you need to get started with ARM templates. You have options for your subscription to Testin, as well as the Azure Quick Start templates on Azure's GitHub repository, as well as VS Code for as an editor, which again, I can't say enough about VS Code. I really, really love it. And I think it's something that's easy to use and to ramp up on. Have you heard of attack vectors in ARM templates? I have not heard of attack vectors in ARM templates. Sounds fairly interesting. And I don't see any other questions in the chat.
I wanted to open it up to any questions for Jennifer. I know she's been answering a couple throughout the presentation, but if anyone's got a question, we'll give you a moment or two to either type it in or feel free to unmute yourself and ask her.
use your typical process ARM templates by hand or do the build outs? So that's an excellent point. I typically may start, it depends on where a client is, right? So our client may already have a template that they want to use. I may have to modify that, add some things, take some things away. If I am stuck on why a resource is not deploying, and I'll actually reshare just one last time, because that's a very good point. Again, like I said, I could go on. So this is what we deployed, our hosting plan and our web app. And what you have the ability to do for any resource, sometimes this is really helpful for troubleshooting, is you have the option to export the templates. If you go to the resource, go down under, usually settings it's under, and you go to export templates, gonna think about it for a quick second. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to generate an ARM template that is representation of that resource. Recently, what was added is the ability to include or exclude parameters in the export template window here. And if you don't include them, it looks a little bit better. It's a little bit more ready to deploy. Thinking about it again. But generally, my starting point is not necessarily to export templates. I usually export templates if I'm troubleshooting something or if I need to see a specific property of a resource and what it's set to. Because again, if you're not familiar with a resource's schema, you may be missing a property. And you may have to deploy it manually through the portal first and then export the template and then see what the proper values for that resource are. That's another way to get there. But generally, I start with what's given to me. If I have to start by hand, then I start by hand. If I have to start with a template, then I start with a template. Can a template be broken down into multiple files? You can, that depends. That's more dependent on resources. So you can separate resources and have different ARM templates for those resources if you want. But you can't just break it up by just parameters or just variables or just resources or things like that. You can break that up by resource if you wish. And one last thing that I want to show you guys is the resources.azure.com portal. I get really excited about ARM templates and I just keep going on, I know. But essentially, what you can do is drill down. You have to authenticate, of course, drill down through your directory, drill down through your resource group that you deployed, drill down through your resources, and you can look at your resource JSON this way as well. And I think I might just do sites, drill down through this way. It gives you a plethora of information about your resource. So if for whatever reason you don't want to export that resource, you can go to this portal and see it this way. You can also, for some resources, it doesn't look like it's letting me do it here. If you have a resource that maybe you deleted 3 days ago and you come back to the portal and it's still there for whatever reason, the ARM service may have encountered an error while deleting. You can force delete from this portal. Please be careful using that because again, it will be gone. So you want to make sure your dependencies aren't the reason that it did not delete the first time. So a lot you can do from this portal documentation. They added some Ansible playbooks to this. It's just really what they're adding to the ARM service is pretty awesome. That was a long answer. What is shown on the Ansible? A playbook. So here we have what you need. I have a cursory relationship with Ansible. I don't use it day to day, but essentially use it to deploy your resource. You can deploy your resources that way. And this is the playbook I believe you would need to do that. So it's pretty interesting stuff. There's multiple ways to look at your resources through the ARM interface. Any other questions? I see another message. Our template looks easier. It depends, right? So, like I said, there are other tools that can be used to deploy ARM resources in the ARM service. One that we use at 10th magnitude sometimes is Terraform. Sometimes the client dictates what we use, and that's fine. But it just depends on what our clients want. And for you guys, if you don't have clients, it just depends on what's easier for you. It's pretty extensible, the ARM service. So there's multiple tools out there that you can use. I think it's good to have an understanding of ARM templates just because you're going to have that deeper understanding of what you're deploying. But you can use whatever tool you like, there's plenty out there.
All right. Any last minute questions for Jennifer? All right. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for just spending the time with us and talking about this. This was absolutely amazing. And thank you for all the references that you put in the chat. If you guys haven't been following along, Jennifer plugged in as she was talking a lot of links, kind of referencing what she was speaking on. So definitely take a look at that. But thank you again, Jennifer. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. I hope that was helpful for you guys to get started.
Yeah, and again, we will be posting a recording of this as well on the Meetup site. So if you want to reference it again, or if you want to pass it along to a friend, feel free to. But thank you guys so much for joining. Stay healthy and safe, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you all.